Shabbat Shalom, everybody. We're picking up in vaYiqra chapter 19, verse 23. So, as is my custom, I want to reread 22 and kind of say a couple things about that before we jump into 23. Now, 22, my translation is, and the Cohen will cover over him, speaking of the guilty person, with the ram of the guilt offering in the presence of Yahweh, a covering over the sin that he sinned, and he will be forgiven for the sin that he sinned. And again, the reason why it's in there 4 times is because the focus in this sentence is supposed to be sin forgiveness, not the covering and all that kind of stuff. I mean, for us, it's like, all right, we messed up. There's a way, for that to be rectified, and that makes us feel good knowing that there is forgiveness in this world and all that. But the sin is actually the focus here. Uh, so let's keep that in mind as we go, because there's several things that happen here. One, we've already learned by studying the law up to this point that the Cohen making the sacrifices for us for sin, he's actually our covering, not the sacrifice itself. The sacrifice represents a number of things. It represents the fact that somebody else suffered because of our sin, and that causes an innocent lamb to have to lose its life. And so even if there are sins where somebody else does not suffer, I think that there's a lot of times we think that you know what we've done didn't hurt anybody else. But I think most of the time that when we sin, we have hurt somebody else. And even if we haven't, even if you can find a situation where what you didn't harm anyone else, an innocent lamb is still going to have to die. That's the price for purity, for being in right standing with God. And why it is, well, we can give you all kinds of, God was working within the confines of what everybody else did in the day, which I kind of bought into for a while, but don't no longer buy into. Right is right, wrong is wrong, and God decides what that is, not man. And so this whole idea of the lamb dying, it's like I said, when you get your punishment, you also get a reward. I mean, God is so unbelievable. We have to sacrifice this lamb because of what we've done, but then we get to have a barbecue and have a nice meal with the family and with our uh, spiritual leader, if you will. That's a terrible way to put it, but you guys know what I mean. So it always has fascinated me that when God does something, there's always so much more to it. And especially when you think about part of our punishment, because killing the lamb is not part of our punishment. It's the fact that we have to pay for that lamb. And boy, if you're poor, that could be really tough. Of course, God made provision for the poor. They only have to kill a couple of doves. And then again, if they're really, really poor, they only have to kill one dove. So I mean, God made it so that these things could be done. And again, we don't, we've begun to practice the uh, sacrifices. We don't kill a lamb. We go down and buy a little piece of lamb. It has already, we buy the kosher kind because it is slaughtered as if it's for a sacrifice. And so we purchase the part that we need, and then we make the sacrifice, and we have ultimately a barbecue and get to have a great meal. So the punishment isn't the lamb. The punishment is the cost of the lamb, and the part of part of that sin offering is that we now have to not confess what we've done, but confess that we have messed up, which I think, oh, I wish everybody would get a hold of that. We don't do this because, you know, I'm not your covering if we're doing a sin offering. The Messiah is your covering, not me. And I'm not the Messiah. I will never be the Messiah. Don't anybody try to turn me into the Messiah after I'm dead, like some other Jews have done. I am nowhere near that. Probably no one's going to make that mistake with me, but it's for a remembrance. It has always been for a remembrance, because the sacrifice of animals has never been the sacrifice. God came right out and said it. He wasn't interested in sacrifice, in the sacrifice of animals. He was interested in obedience, if you recall. And so it's a remembrance that we're not being obedient. That's the whole point. That's why the focus needs to be on the sin, so that we realize we have been disobedient. Oh, so let's see. There's one other thing I wanted to point out about that before I moved on. Again, and I spoke about this last week in great detail, I think, about what sin is and what sin is not. It's so important that people understand what it is and what it isn't, and quit trying to make their own version of what sin is and isn't. God laid it out very clearly. A rabbi who gave us the Mishnah laid it out in a single sentence. Incredible, right? What it is and what it isn't. And as long as we keep in mind what it is and what it isn't, then we don't beat ourselves up for things that are not sin. So anyway, now we have discussed, you know, in from verses basically 2 to 20, the basic things that we do to live a summed up version of the things that we do to live a holy life, and that's going to continue on to the end of this chapter. But there's some things here, particularly in this chapter, that I think are very interesting. So a very straightforward English translation of verse 23 says, "And for shall go they to the land, and planted them all tree from food, and uncircumcised them uncircumcise he. Fruit he 3 years, he will be to you uncircumcised, not he eat." Or ate. It's actually in past tense. That can be very confusing. So let's step through this. It starts off with the key, which is in 4, tavohu, shall go they. So he's speaking, God is speaking through these words, and saying that the Jews are about to go into the promised land. And in that promised land, there's going to be some things already there. All right. So, and this is the word bo, which is to go and to come. They're the same word. They have the same meaning, because you can't arrive at a place without having gone to that place. You go to that place to arrive in that place. You leave that place to go to another place. So this is really common in Middle Eastern culture, where this one word means to come and to go. And it's also still common in places like Africa. There's many of their dialects that still use their word for go and come. It's the same word. So anyway, they're going to go, Mrs. L, which is to ha-aretz, to the land. Unetatem, and planted them. Now, the people who are going are not the ones who have planted. Them in this case are the people that were there previously. So, and it's what you think of. They took some seeds and they dug a hole in the ground. They put the seeds in the ground. They covered over with dirt and put water on it, and eventually things grew up, right? And so, planting is anything, grapes, trees, fruit trees, Well, it doesn't even have to be fruit trees. If you planted an oak tree, you planted an oak tree, right? So of course we're going to be very specific in this sentence about fruit trees and things that you plant that you can eat, like corn and wheat, hay that horses eat, not us. But so these things are planted. And then it says kol etz. So it's all the trees. So we're speaking specifically of trees here. And then it says ma'achal, from food. So fruit trees. Every tree that has been planted from which you can derive food. Then it says va'araltem. Wow. And they're uncircumcised. Your trees are uncircumcised. Now, you did know, right, that there are male trees and female trees? Did you guys know that? And the little bumblebugs and butterflies and, what are those little bitty birds, that hummingbirds and stuff like that? They go and they get the nectar, from those trees, and they get the pollen on them, and they go from essentially from the male trees to the female trees and back and forth. And that's how the pollination takes place and how the fruit begins to grow. So so the boy trees need to be circumcised? No. But what I find interesting here is that one of the biggest mistakes made in understanding the New Testament letters, it's partially because by the time the Jews began to have to deal with the New Testament letters, they were no longer in Israel. They had no temple, they had no priests, and for the most part, they had no legitimate rabbin. And I will come right out and say that those men were not legitimate. They didn't even speak the Hebrew language. They didn't know the customs, the history, the culture. They were not legitimate as far as I'm concerned. And these men started looking at the New Testament stuff, and they're reading about the circumcised and the uncircumcised, and that gets translated into all the way into the English, which didn't happen until the 11 and 12, literally the 1200s, and then from there down, the different varieties of English. Because most people who speak English, if you try to read a handwritten Bible, whether it's the Hebrew Bible or it's a Bible, the Hebrew Bible with New Testament letters in it, you wouldn't be able to understand most of it. You wouldn't be able to make it out. But it's English. English has changed and changed and changed. We've added letters, we've taken away letters, we've added sounds and taken away sounds. A lot of things have happened to our alphabet since we began, and so there's a lot of these changes. And one of the things that happened in all of this translation stuff is this thing that got lost in translation, I should say. Uncircumcised means unclean. These trees are considered unclean. There's nothing there for you to circumcise. So, but they're using the very same word that is used ultimately in the New Testament comes from this word. It started off Hebrew, turned into Greek, and then Latin, and back to Greek from the Latin, and then into German, and eventually what you read now is it's just generations and generations and generations away from what it used to be, such that scholars at great colleges have no clue that the New Testament in its entirety was written in Hebrew. That's a shame. So when they start reading about the circumcised and the uncircumcised, they think that the circumcised are the Jews and the uncircumcised are the non-Jews, not realizing that the circumcised are the Jews who live a pure life and the uncircumcised are the Jews who live an impure life. The people who the New Testament call Gentiles was not used of non-Jews. It was used of Jews who were from other nations, because it's ultimately, it comes from going. That's the word for nation. And so if you're a Jew and you're from Italy, you were called a Gentile. If you were a Jew and say you lived in Israel, but you lived out where what do they call that, metropolis? It was some form of metropolis. That's not the word they use, but I think it was some form of that. And in this place, it had what they call the cardia, and that's it's like when you go into the center of town, and you have the cross section in the middle of the town. That's called the cardia for heart. If in case you're catching that. And the people from that particular place, the Jews, did not speak Hebrew at all. They spoke Greek. They did not speak Latin. Uh, the very well-educated, rich people learned to speak Latin, but that was not the common language of the New Testament, nor was Greek. Greek was not the common language. What am I saying? Aramaic was not the common language of the New Testament period. That's the moment the Jews left their captivity in Persia, they went right back to speaking the Hebrew language. The common language in Israel in the first century was Hebrew. The common language among the non-Jews was Greek, not Latin. The whole Aramaic Latin thing comes from the Catholic Church. They are utterly and completely wrong. They were never right, but it's been something they've been saying for so long now that it's one of those lies that have been repeated so many times that it's absolute truth. You can't even say it in front of some people without being attacked. They're wrong, you're right, but it's one of those things that so much so that when Mel Gibson did The Passion of Christ, of course, now remember, he's Catholic. The Jews spoke in Aramaic, which they would not have done, and the Greeks spoke in Latin, which they would not have done. But I digress. It's not important. But that's how this whole uncircumcised, circumcised thing gets so mixed up particularly in the letter. It's called the Acts of the Apostles. They're having this conversation, and they're using the word circumcised, uncircumcised. And so the Christians say, see there, we're the uncircumcised and they're the circumcised. And so now men don't have to be circumcised anymore. And that eventually became Christians don't have to follow the law anymore. Christians did follow the law. My grandmother through marriage, at least for a while, but she's really the only grandmother I ever had. My grandmother, the Jewish grandmother, was never in my life. Neither one of them. Mom's side, dad's side, they weren't in my life. But this American Indian Christian woman was in my life for a number of years. And she got involved in the whole Christianity thing during the Azusa Street thing. She's, because I think that was the 1930s. So she would have been right in the big middle of all of that. She wouldn't even read the New Testament. This is a Christian. And people of that generation would not read the New Testament. They believed in following God's law. So Christianity used to do that. But people don't know that anymore. And so they think that it's always been this way. No, it hasn't. Things have changed massively over my lifetime. So the uncircumcised were the unclean Jews. They weren't unclean because they weren't circumcised. They were Jews. They were circumcised. And when the guy Kepa, they call Peter, he said, we can't put more on them than what we don't do ourselves. Hello, that should be the smoking gun for everybody. He was circumcised. He wouldn't have been allowed to eat the Passover with Yeshua, the guy they called Jesus. None of them would have been allowed to eat the Passover unless they were circumcised, because that's the law. And they didn't have a New Testament. They only had what the Christians call the Old. Do you follow what I'm saying? So he's not saying that about circumcision. He's saying that about something else, which is explained in my translation of the New Testament. We'll let you know when that comes out. It's almost ready, but who knows when I'll get it finished. So the uncircumcised, circumcised is about being pure according to the law and not being pure according to the law. And we see that right here in this verse, because you can't circumcise a tree. And just pruning limbs is not circumcising a tree. So God's using this terminology about a tree. So he says you're going to get there, and all of the trees that from which you could get fruit, he's saying you have to consider them uncircumcised. In other words, you have to consider them unclean, not fit to eat. They're not kosher, if you will, to use a modern term. So we have Me'achal is from the food. Ve'aral. Oh, I can't roll my R's. My throat is so dry I can't even speak. Va'aral tem. I'm just do it without rolling my R. That's and circumcised them. In other words, they're not circumcised. Lato is uncircumcised. So then it says at Peter go, and again, I can't roll my R's today. I am really fighting with the dry mouth thing. So that's the word. The fruit of it is uncircumcised. It's unclean, because you don't circumcise fruit either. I hope anyone that's Christian and hearing me is starting to get the idea here that uncircumcised and circumcised is about whether it's pure or unpure. And then it says shalosh, which is 3. Shanim. So that's shana is year, shanim is years. So 3 years. Yiyeh, it will be. Lachem, to you. To you, not to everybody else in the world. To those of you who are in covenant with God, to you. So if you're a Christian saying I live in covenant with God, this is talking to you. Literally, it's talking to the Jews. But if you're living in covenant, that means you're living according to the law, because that is the covenant. And so whoever is living according to the covenant, that's who we're talking about. We're not going to go out and tell other people they can't eat that fruit. We're not going to go out and tell other people that when you plant a tree, you got to let it grow for 3 years, and if you eat any of the fruit, you're sinning. No, it said lachem, to you. It will be to you. Reilim. Oh, I got it out. Uncircumcised. It will be to you uncircumcised. I want you to just go out and circumcise it and eat the fruit. Oh, wait, maybe you have to uncircumcise the fruit before you eat it. No, you can't. You cannot circumcise a tree. You cannot circumcise fruit. It is unclean. And then it says, Lo yiachel, you will not eat it. It's not kosher. It's not pure. It's not clean before God. There's 2 things I can think of here that, now God's not explaining why it's unclean. Maybe later on he will, but right now he's not telling you why this thing is unclean. Well, you could say, well, it's because, non-Jews planted it and they're evil people and full of sin and blah, blah, blah. You could blame it on that and say that's why it's unclean. And so 3 years later, somehow it's going to purify itself. If it's already growing fruit, maybe it's already 3 years old. You don't know, right? So I find that to be an argument I can't get on board with. But maybe, and this is just a theory, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to give any kind of technical advice here, or I'm not trying to say this is the reason, I'm not trying to say that. But, maybe they were fertilizing that tree with human feces. People are doing that to this day, and it's killing them, and they don't know they don't know why. Oh, it's terrible. But I mean, the Germans did that in when the whole Nazi Germany thing was going on. They took Jews and made them, you know, fertilize that way. We just recently heard. I want to say it was in Africa, but something inside saying it wasn't in Africa this time, but somebody else was doing the same thing. And oh no, it was India. Somewhere in India, they were taking human feces and using it as fertilizer for their fruit or for whatever they were planting. Well, yeah, the seeds will grow up and you'll get lots of fruit and all that kind of stuff, but that stuff can kill you. It's not that it will, but it can and quite often does. You do not want something like that. So maybe the land needed 3 years to purify from bad uh, farming practices, right? But again, it's just a theory, and that's all you can get on something like this. If God doesn't come right out and say this is why, everything's just speculation. And I hope you understand that what I've said is speculation. It'd be a good reason if that were the reason, but I'm not going to throw that on a group of people I know nothing about. I don't know if that culture did that sort of thing. Not everybody did. All right. So my translation. And when you enter the land and you have planted, oh no, see, this is them planting. I was thinking the trees are already there. No, and you have planted all of your trees for food. They, speaking of the trees, are very unclean because it uses circumcised twice here. And so we'll say very unclean because we're trying to emphasize. I could have said unclean and put a explanation point there, but what we generally do is just say very unclean. So it's unclean, unclean is how it was said. Well, uncircumcised, uncircumcised, and we know that that means unclean. So those trees that you planted in that land will be very unclean, will be uncircumcised. The fruit of those trees will be uncircumcised. For 3 years, you will not eat it. So when we planted some fruit trees here on our property when we got here, and we didn't eat the fruit for 3 years, waiting around. And at the time, I couldn't remember if it was 3 years or 5 years, and we wound up waiting 5 years. And so by the time we could eat the fruit, it quit producing fruit. Trees just are just there. We get no fruit. Can't get any of the little bumblebugs to go down to the front of the yard. I guess because there's a road there and the noise scares them. I don't know. I even took little uh, old Coke cans when we got here. They were all, well, I guess these were beer cans. They were everywhere. I'm still finding beer cans and beer bottles. Uh, you know, they work their way up from the ground because we lose some every time we have a hard rain. And but anyway, they cut the bottoms off and put just a little bit of root beer because I noticed that honeybees love root beer. Be careful if you're sitting on your front porch drinking root beer because I nearly swallowed a live honeybee one day. I picked up the can and wasn't thinking about it. Took a swig and oop, took him out of my mouth and he's all wet and he just kind of crawled away. I put him on the banister and he just crawled around for a while and he eventually flew away. So they love root beer. So I went around and put these little pieces of, the bottom parts of the can. I cut them out and I fastened them into the tree and put a little bit of root beer in there, trying to entice, because we get honeybees up by the house, but they just don't want to go down to the front of the property where they could do us some good. So anyway, we did this and didn't even get any fruit. Oh, well, I probably had terrible sin in my life. And it's just the way it goes. I probably need to fertilize them next year and, work on something like that because they don't get a lot of water and they certainly don't get a lot of nourishment in that sand down there. So who knows? But it's uncircumcised. In other words, it's unclean. Okay, well, I've kind of already said this, but I'd put a note in here about the word for uncircumcision, and I said English Bibles tend to translate that word as "you shall count the fruit as uncircumcised," or "you shall count the fruit as circumcised foreskin." I actually found one that said that. But again, this is a Hebrew idiom that means that the fruit needs to go through a purification process. God doesn't want you to eat anything planted, any tree that you plant that bears food that can be eaten needs to go through a 3-year process. And when I was growing up, we lived in this one place where, well, actually, we lived in two different places when I was a kid where all of the housing was kind of grouped together in one place, and all the fields that everybody planted and worked were in a different place. And the second one that we were at was much bigger than the first one. I used to sit around and listen to, these were all non-Jewish people that would talk about planning and all that. And I never forget one time this woman started talking, and she's sitting there by her husband. There's a lot of couples sitting around, and she started talking about, can you believe so and so dug up his, harvested his tomato plants, and he took all the good stuff off and kept it for himself and threw all that garbage down. His harvest next year isn't going to be worth a hoot. And she was right about it. Um, so but and they everybody got to talking about it and said, oh yeah, that first 3 to 5 years you should always take your very best and put it right back in the ground. Just leave it, leave it there, because somehow that makes your fruit trees get, are we still on? I just hit this thing. Your fruit trees get better fruit somehow, and your tomatoes, you get better tomatoes if you do that. Well, I'm sure that in a very roundabout way came right out of this verse. I'm, I mean, think about it. God's just talking about fruit trees here, but this idea of just letting ground and letting it rot onto the ground, there's something about that regeneration process that somehow makes that fruit even better. And that is true of, as far as I know, of pretty much anything you plant that is food. And I know that just simply because I grew up on a farm. I don't know that, I can't give you empirical evidence or something like that. So, maybe science has found that that's nothing but a wives' tale. I don't know. But I'm not trying to argue something that I shouldn't be. I um I have opened the wrong file and am thus at the end of this file and can't go any further. Let me see if, oh man, I really thought I'd opened the right file. Let me see if I can find this other, well, this isn't working. Oh, that's really strange. Well, I can't even make I'm sorry, I'm stuck. I can't make it do anything. It's not frozen up. I mean, I can use my little rolly ball and go back and forth with the words, but I can't click on the screen. I can't get it to where I can make that go down and I can pull up the other. I'm done. Sorry. I really thought I had the right file open, but I obviously did not. Oh, wait. Hold on just a second. There is another thing here. Oh, but I can't even. Oh, that's so weird. I realized this morning that this file was open twice. It's not the same file, and I picked the wrong one, and now I can't get back to the right one. So I did open the right one, but I didn't shut down. The right one and the wrong one both opened up, and now Microsoft won't allow me to do anything. I kind of think I know why, because they've been trying to force me to log on and give them all my personal information. And in spite of the fact that I've turned off everything in that computer that says anything about connection to the internet, they still are still connecting to my computer and doing whatever they want to do to it. And right now they're trying to force me into joining up and giving them all my private information. I'm just like phooey on that. But this is the price I'm paying now because I can't get to the rest of the file. So I'm going to have to close up with that. Shalom v'shalom, everybody.
The blessing, vaYiqra. Yavarecha Yahweh v'yish merecha. Ya'er Yahweh panai v'lecha v'hunecha. Yisa Yahweh panai v'lecha v'yasim lecha shalom. And in English, may Yahweh cause you to lie down so that you may rest. May he touch and caress you. May he prepare you for what is ahead. May he watch over you. May he keep you from harm. May he cause goodness to grow in you and take away the bad. May he arrange your life and cause you to flourish. May he cheer you up and gladden your heart. May he cause his light to shine through you. May he show you tenderness, favor, and love in his presence. May he show you kindness and be delicate towards you. May he show you his generosity, mercy, compassion, and desire for you as it comes forth from the depths of his soul. May he lift you out of your pit and deliver you from the things that hold you prisoner. May he draw you to his chest and cast his eyes on yours. May he show you his love and desire for you as he cradles you in his arms. May he bear your punishment and pardon you of your sin. May he take you for his bride. May he establish a foundation in you. May he place his name on your heart and mind and make your body his temple. May you be his treasure. May you always be on his mind. May he draw you near and comfort you when you are afraid. May he assure you there is nothing to fear because he is with you. May you and all that concerns you be at peace because he is your friend. Amen.